I'm Brigit, and I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio Code team here at Microsoft. I'm super excited to be back on Tabs vs. Spaces to talk even more about remote development in Visual Studio Code. As we discussed last time, remote development allows you to develop against a separate machine or sandbox your development environment to avoid impacting your local machine's configuration. In VS Code, we essentially have three different options for remote development. You can use a container, you can use the Windows subsystem for Linux or WSL, and you can use a remote machine or a virtual machine through SSH. With each of these, you feel like you're developing locally because you get all the awesome features of VS Code, like syntax highlighting and debugging and completions, but you're actually working with a separate or an isolated environment. In the previous episode of Tabs vs. Spaces, we focused on remote WSL and remote SSH in VS Code. And in today's episode, we're going to focus on the container-based experiences that we have in VS Code. So what is a container? A container is a piece of software that packages your code and all the dependencies that your code needs to run, like the runtime, tools, libraries, and even settings. When you create a container, its initial contents goes into what's known as an image. You define an image using a file known as a Docker file, and when you run that image, then it becomes a container. In the following diagram, you can see that each container contains an app, so for instance, like a Python app, and then it also includes that app's dependencies, so like the Python runtime and libraries. By including those dependencies, we're able to keep our host computer, which is the host OS and infrastructure, free and clear of any extra downloads or dependencies, which is really convenient. We can use a Docker container as our development environment, which is a concept known as development containers or dev containers. And we can actually open any sort of folder or repository inside those containers and start working on them. This is really cool because it gives us a lot of really helpful functionality, such as you can just start jumping into working on different applications or code bases without having to worry about setting up their dependencies because that's already set up for you, which is really helpful for code bases that may have more complex dependencies like C++. You can also switch between tech stacks more easily. Like you could jump from a Node.js project to a C# project and then to a Java project. You can also move between different versions of tools more easily. Like you can go between Python 3.7 and then to Python 2.7 without having to worry about uninstalling or managing different versions of tools on your computer. You could actually have a different dev container for each of your code bases or each of your projects, depending on how your company works and what works best for each of your projects. Dev containers are even an interesting tool in education as well. They can save students a lot of setup time because you can actually just add a dev container to a project, and then students don't have to worry about going ahead and downloading different dependencies for each of their projects or classes at the beginning of each new semester. We have a couple of ways that we can do container-based development in Visual Studio Code. We have the Remote Containers extension, which allows you to use a Docker container on your local machine as an isolated environment, and you can open any sort of folder or GitHub repository and do development work there. We also have GitHub Codespaces, which provides a cloud-based or cloud-powered environment for any sort of development work. In this episode of Tabs vs. Spaces, we're going to be taking a look at both remote containers and GitHub Codespaces and doing some demos in each environment. The Remote Containers extension in Visual Studio Code is a great solution to containerize your setup locally. All of your containers are going to reside on your local machine. So if we go ahead, the first thing that we need to make sure is that Docker is running. So what I can do here is open up and show hidden icons. And I can verify here that Docker Desktop is running. And if you don't have Docker Desktop installed, you can go ahead and grab the free Community Edition. And it's also worth noting that Docker Desktop for Windows works both on Windows and it works on Linux with WSL. All right, so now to actually get into using the Remote Containers extension, now that we know Docker Desktop is running, because remote containers, it does work on all three platforms. It works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Let's go ahead and see. So here I am just within a simple node repo here. And I don't have any sort of dev container set up or anything like that. And I like to be able to go ahead and run this application. And I'd like to do it through a dev container setup. So let's see how it works. So to begin, I want to make sure I have the remote containers extension installed. So I'm just going to look in the extensions viewlet, and it looks like I do, which is great. Whenever I have one of the remote extensions installed in Visual Studio Code, I have this green remote indicator added to the bottom left, which I can click on to then have access to my remote commands. What I'm going to do here is say remote containers, add development container configuration files. Now, the remote containers extension is pretty smart. It's able to detect what kind of application that I'm actually working within. So it knows that I'm actually working in a Node app. So it's going to suggest, hey, I think you want to add some sort of Node container, and you want to work in a Node dev container. So I'm going to go ahead and select this first Node option. We can see that you actually have tons of other options for other kinds of apps that you might want to work with. And I can see that I can choose my version of Node. I'll go with 14, which is the default. And there we go. So now we can see we have this new folder that was added here, .dev container. And we're also notified that we now have a dev container configuration file, and we're able to reopen our folder to develop within a container now. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we do that. So I'm going to say reopen in container. And we can see that now VS Code notifies us that we are starting our dev container. And here we are. And now, if we actually want to see what kind of files were added to our application. So we have this dev container.json, and we have a Docker file. So earlier, I had mentioned that a Docker file essentially defines what goes into our image or what goes into our container. And this one is pretty brief. So it essentially just includes what is our image or what's going to be included. And we're grabbing it from a container registry, which is like a repository or a collection of images. And this one is going to be a JavaScript and Node image, which makes sense because we want to go ahead and work in a Node dev container. And we're grabbing it from MCR, which is the Microsoft Container Registry, which is a really popular container registry. Another container registry you might have heard of is Docker Hub. And you can see that you can further customize your Docker file for even more possibilities for having some really useful and customized dev containers. So we have a variety of options here, but we'll just go ahead and work with the default that the extension provided us here to start off with. And now moving over to devcontainer.json, this goes ahead and customizes VS Code even further and tells VS Code some further ways to connect to our dev container. So for instance, it can give us a name for our container. So for instance, our dev container is named Node.js. And when we take a look at our remote indicator now in the bottom left, VS Code tells us that we're connected to a dev container, we're developing within it, and it's a Node.js dev container. So that's pretty cool. It tells us where we're working. It's able to tell us where our Docker file is and what the name of the Docker file is that we're working with. It's able to set up some settings for us. So for instance, what type of bash shell to use. And we can even set up some extensions to automatically install for us. So here it says that the ESLint extension should automatically be installed whenever we're using this dev container. So let's go ahead and check out if that happened. I'm going to go over to the extensions viewlet. And sure enough, it happened. We can see that ESLint was installed for us, which is super neat. You can also notice that in the extensions viewlet, and very similarly, this happens when working with the other remote experiences like SSH and WSL. We have locally installed extensions, so extensions that are installed on the VS Code side, and we have installed extensions on the remote side, so extensions that are installed in the dev container itself. And we have some further settings or properties that we can customize in our dev container. So we can go ahead and forward ports if we'd like to access a service or another part of our app that is being published within our container. and we can run some commands within our container, and we can even determine if we'd like to have root access or not within our container. So for instance, with this remote user. So for instance, if we'd like to go ahead and automatically yarn install, so we have all of our dependencies set up for us whenever we use this dev container, I can uncomment this line. Then whenever we make a change in one of our dev container configuration files, which is devcontainer.json or the Docker file, what we need to go ahead and make sure we do is rebuild our container. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild. And we can see here our image is being built and our container is starting. All right. And now anytime that we access this dev container, now we know that our dependencies are going to automatically be installed for us, which helps save us a little bit of time in setup, which is great. Alrighty, so now let's go ahead and try running this app and see if it works. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit F5. All right, and we can see that my service was running on port 3000. I'm going to open in browser. And hello, remote world. So our app is successfully running. We're able to run an app using remote containers in VS Code. All right, so we could have actually gotten this exact sample along with a few others in the remote containers extension itself. So I'm going to go back to the remote indicator here, and I'm going to close this remote connection for now. And I'll go back here again. And I can see we have this try a sample command, and we have quite a few language options here. And I'm curious in trying out a Python sample. But if I wanted to go ahead and grab the exact sample that I had seen in the previous demo, I could grab the Node one. But again, I'm going to look at Python because I'm doing quite a bit of Python work. So I want to go ahead and try out a Python dev container. So you can see here in the bottom right, again, we're starting up our dev container. And then our remote indicator, again, updates to show that we are working in our Python 3 dev container. And we're always going to have this .dev container folder with our devcontainer.json and our Docker file within it. Alrighty, and we can see that we have now a Flask application. And let's see how quickly we can just go ahead and get up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and select F5, see what happens. Alrighty, so it says our application is running. I'm going to go ahead and ignore this one right now, this notification, because I'm actually more curious about the port that was forwarded here. Yes, let's go ahead and open this up. And we can see that we were actually able to go ahead and run a Flask application within, what was that, like 30 seconds, a minute? So VS Code can do that? Yes, it can. And if I go back into VS Code, and I'll just go ahead and stop running my app. If I check the version of Python I have, I'll just do a Python -- version. I can see that I have Python 3.9.1 installed in this dev container. And just out of curiosity, I can see that I don't have Python installed at all on my local machine. So this is super useful that I can just go ahead and start working within a completely different tech stack that I don't have installed at all on my local machine. And I could even do things like setting breakpoints and doing some debugging within this app. So I could go ahead and set a breakpoint. Again, I'll hit F5, and then I can do some inspecting, look at some variables, continue, all that sort of functionality. So again, super useful, super quick to get up and running. All right, so that was super quick and easy. But what if I have a more complicated app? Or in the first demo, we saw how we were able to add some configuration files. But what if I have an application that already has some dev container configuration files? Can I go ahead and work with that or open that up in VS Code? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this remote connection again. So I'll close this dev container. And now what I'm going to do, again, open up this remote indicator. And now I'm going to use the command clone repository in container volume. And I'm going to choose a GitHub repository that already has a dev container definition or some configuration files within it. So it already has that .dev container folder with that devcontainer.json and that Docker file in it. So I know that URL, and I'm just going to make it correct there. Alrighty. I actually am able to include a branch, so that was correct. And here I have the option to include or to choose between a unique volume or a new volume. And now a volume, you may be wondering, that's essentially a storage mechanism for our containers. And a volume is actually the preferred storage mechanism for our containers because it is more performant than the other option, which is a bind mount. And volumes are more performant because they essentially avoid the overhead that's required if you were going to be essentially having to bridge the gap between Linux and then the Windows file system. So it's great that we have the option to use volumes here. So I'm going to go ahead and you can choose either option. I'm going to create a unique volume. Okay, so here we are. We can see again, starting up our dev container. We are well familiar with this notification now. We can see that it already recognizes now the name of our repo here, which is cool. And you may have noticed that before when I pasted in that URL, you are able to choose a specific branch, which is nice. And here I'm able to see that I was able to clone from a specific branch, which is really helpful. Yeah, so we can see here that it successfully picked up our .dev container folder. So now VS Code recognizes that we're actually connected to an Azure Functions and Node.js dev container, so slightly more complex here. So now if, for instance, I run the command here, we can see that I actually have Azure Functions core tools installed. It's another really cool set of tools that I wouldn't normally have installed on my machine, or I don't currently have installed, that now I'm able to develop within this environment. And what I can do, start the front end here, do an npm run start. I'll close that old tab. All right, so we're starting up our React app front end. And while that's loading, so we haven't started our back end yet, I'm going to go ahead and start our back end. Alrighty, so you can see here, launching that. Cool, our service is launched there. So now if I refresh, we should be able to populate some data, and awesome. So now we are successfully able to use remote containers again in Visual Studio Code for an even more complex containerized setup on our local machine. Similar to remote containers, GitHub Codespaces is great for being able to contribute to projects without complicating your local setup. You're able to spin up new dev environments with ease and contribute to a variety of projects, regardless of what you have installed on your local machine. So here we can see that they provide an instant dev environment. It is worth noting that GitHub Codespaces is still in a beta edition or a beta state, so you will want to request early access through the site. You're able to use the tools you love. So you can do both a browser-based version, which is going to provide a VS Code interface, along with a desktop version. There's quite a few different languages installed out of the box, like Python and Node and PHP. So it comes with tons of tools available for you to further simplify your setup and get you started instantly with a cloud-based development environment. Again, you can customize with a variety of settings and extensions and so on. And yeah, so let's go ahead and get into a demo so we can see GitHub Codespaces in action. All right, so here I have a simple Express app, and let's go ahead and create a new code space on it and work within it. I'm going to select the code drop-down menu and then open with Codespaces. And here I can create a new code space. And now my code space is going to go ahead and prepare. And what's really nice about Codespaces is that it's pretty easy to switch between different repositories in GitHub, go ahead and commit to them, jump between different projects, maybe that I'm working on or that some of my colleagues are working on, and so on. Alrighty, and now that this is getting set up, we can see that the code space went ahead and pulled in the files and folders that I had in my application there, which is nice. We can see also that the interface that we have here is pretty similar to what VS Code looks like and what I would expect, which is nice. Alrighty, and so now it looks like things are getting loaded up, which is great. And let's go ahead and open up this app.js. So we can see here that this looks like a pretty standard Express application, nothing too crazy here. We can also see that in the lower left, it's similar to how when we're connected to any of the other remote extensions in VS Code, like before when it said we were connected to a dev container, now it says that we are using Codespaces. So that's a nice element there. Okay, so let's go ahead and try running this application. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the run viewlet here. I'm going to go ahead and create a launch.json. And this is very similar, actually pretty much the same to the VS Code flow locally. So I'll go ahead and add that. And now let's try launching our program in Codespaces. All right, so now we can see that our service is running on port 3000. So let's go ahead and open it up. And here we go. So this is the output we were hoping for. It says, welcome to our Express app. And we're able to successfully forward a port and access it within our code space in our browser. And just like our other remote experiences, we can feel like we're working locally still in our code space because we get things like debugging, syntax highlighting, completions. We can set breakpoints and so on. And if we didn't want to actually work within the browser, we can connect to our code space within the desktop VS Code client as well. So what I can do here is I can actually open this, and I can say open in VS Code or open in VS Code Insiders. So I'll say open in VS Code, and I'll select open. We can see here that VS Code opens here. And in order to do this, I already have installed the GitHub Codespaces extension in VS Code. So now I'm going to say open. A new window pops up. And now we can see that we are setting up our remote connection to our code space. And here we go. Now we have access to that same application, and we are connected to a code space. We can see in the remote indicator here. And so we can explore our app here from GitHub. And if we go over to the source control viewlet here, we can see we can commit to things in GitHub. So we can have that same type of source control changes that we would like to make and that we would expect in this type of flow. We can run our application. So if I go ahead and launch program, this went ahead and forwarded to port 3000, just like it did in the browser. And then both locally and in the browser, we're then able to commit changes directly to our repository. So I could do it here, or I could do it in the browser. So I'll navigate back to the browser. And what I can do here is I'll go over to the source control, and I'll say add launch.json. I can go ahead and commit it. I will go ahead and stage and commit all of my changes. I'm going to push my changes. And then if I go to my Express app in the browser now, we can see that that change was persisted. So Codespaces gives us this really convenient flow where we can work with our applications live, we can run them, we can debug them, we get that awesome remote development experience in a VS Code interface. We have access to things like extensions, and we can go ahead and have a full GitHub commit pull request flow as well. Now, while Codespaces has a lot of our favorite languages and some tools already installed for us, we can even further customize it by using a dev container. And the dev container that we're going to use is going to have the same exact setup that we used in remote containers. So you may recognize this repo from one of our previous demos in the remote container section. So it's going to be that same repo that used Azure Functions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new code space on it, and let's take a look at how it looks. I'm going to select this code dropdown, open with Codespaces. Here you can see how it looks if you already have a code space created, but I'm going to go ahead and create a fresh code space. Now we're preparing our code space here. And Codespaces is a good option where maybe if you don't have Docker installed on your local machine, you can go ahead and access some further customized dev environments through a Codespace, since you don't need to have Docker installed on your machine to use Codespaces. You can just hop into your environments through Codespaces. And we can see here, now it's building our custom container that we had designated through that .dev container folder. All right, and now that our custom container was built and is running, we can go ahead and start working within our Codespace. We see we have access to all of those files that were within our repo. We see that custom dev container.json and Docker file already here. And now we could go ahead and start working within our application just like we were doing within VS Code before in the remote containers extension. And we could see again that we're specifically on the update container branch, just like we had done it when we cloned in a container volume before. So just to double check, I'm going to run this command to make sure that we have the proper tools installed. So yep, we have Azure Function Core tools installed. Because again, while Codespaces has a lot of awesome tools installed for us already, we wanted to even further customize it by installing Azure Function Core tools. So I'm going to do npm run start the front end there. All right. And it automatically takes care of port forwarding, which is super helpful. Now I'm going to start our node functions backend there. Okay. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and refresh. And awesome, we can see that our data populated and we are fully running that same application. So we can see that we have options to run our apps that are customized with some containers in both remote containers and in GitHub Codespaces. So we have a variety of options depending on what fits our needs and what fits our preferences as well. Thanks so much for joining me today to learn more about remote development with Visual Studio Code. If you want to learn more, we definitely recommend checking out our documentation. We also recommend checking out the GitHub Codespaces landing page, so that way you can learn even more about Codespaces and you can go ahead and sign up to try it out. You can also open up an issue or feature request on our remote release GitHub repository, and you can also tweet us, so at code or at my personal Twitter handle. And again, thank you so much and happy coding.